Hello and welcome back to my world of stuff. My name is Paul Mount. This is a video which I've wanted to do for quite some time, quite a few months in fact, but I really want to do it justice. I didn't want to just throw something together. So whilst I know a fair bit about the background of this show, I wanted to do a little bit more research and just present something a bit more factual about one of my favourite TV shows of all time. There are true experts of this show out there who will know all the finer points and all the details and so on. So apologies if there's any slight misrepresentations in what I'm about to talk about for the next half an hour or so. Hopefully there won't be. Hopefully though, I'll be able to tell you quite a little bit about one of my favourite TV shows, as I mentioned. Now, I love an ensemble show. I love a show which has a big cast of characters. And as a kid, I used to love those sort of shows because I used to like seeing characters appear in certain episodes, and then some episodes different characters would appear. Some characters would be in the background, some would be in the foreground. And I think one of the great proponents of that sort of ensemble television making, whether it was in live action or in puppets, was of course the great Gerry Anderson, who with his wife Sylvia created this tide of fantastic adventure series throughout the 1960s. I've spoken of these shows before, haven't done a lot of in-depth stuff on them yet, but that will be corrected over the next few months because I'm planning a lot more Anderson related content. If you're of a similar vintage to me, and I do apologise if you are, you will have your favourite Gerry Anderson shows from the 60s if you're a fan of his output. You may have liked Stingray or Fireball XL5 or even further back Supercar. Thunderbirds, of course, was his big, massive breakthrough show in the 60s, his big defining hit. That was followed, of course, by Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons. Then Joe 90 and the Supermarionation era came to an end in 1969, a bit ignominiously with the much derided and frankly not very good Secret Service. But for me, the best Gerry Anderson show of all time was one that sort of straddled the Supermarionation and the live action by marrying the best of the Supermarionation visual effects techniques with a new human dynamic of actors instead of puppets, or little bastards as Gerry Anderson himself was often known to call his puppet creations. UFO, for me, Anderson's finest hour. We had Space 1999, which followed on. We had Terrorhawks, we had Space Precinct. UFO wasn't the end of Anderson's work on TV, but I still contend that it's not only the finest show of that era of television, the Gerry Anderson Century 21 productions and so on, but I think it's still a show that is, in many ways, still years ahead of its time. Hello, welcome back. If you are new here, if you have clicked on this video because you saw the UFO logo and pictures of UFOs and thought, oh, I like that one, please stick around because this channel deals with a lot of retro TV and films. You'll find further back on the channel features on Space 1999, Land of the Giants, Catweasel, Survivors, lots of classic shows from the 70s, and there's a lot more to come. So this is a retro channel with a little smattering of new bits and pieces, and of course quite a little bit of Doctor Who here and there. But today I want to talk about UFO because it's a show that's very special to me. As I mentioned in the intro, it is my favourite of Gerry Anderson's shows from the 60s into the 70s, and would rate very highly in my top 5, in fact, of all-time TV shows. Most of my top 5, in fact, most of my top 10 would probably be made up of classic genre shows. Much as we have great fantasy sci-fi shows around these days, and I've enjoyed things like Three Body Problem, Silo, recently Paradise, things like The Walking Dead. There have been some great shows in recent times, but I think when you step back to look at your absolute favourites of all time, you're always going to go back to the ones that you watched when you were younger, the ones that sort of formulated you as a person and created the sort of things that you're interested in. UFO, however, has a very special place in my heart because there's something about that show that just absolutely captivates me. It is, as I'm sure you know, the quite dark story of a sort of a war between Earth and an alien planet. It's not an all guns blazing war. It's a story about what we believe is a dying race far out across space who have found a way to travel the vast untractable distances between Earth and their planet because their own species is dying out. The background of the aliens isn't particularly well defined, which I think works in the show's favour. But as the show starts, the suggestion is that they are coming to Earth to harvest body parts because their own bodies are dying. It's quite a gruesome idea, which isn't actually overdeveloped in the series. They don't refer to it all that much after the first few episodes. It's just sort of something that's in the background. Earth has become aware that it is under attack by an alien force, and 10 years ago, because this is set in 1980 of course, an organisation was set up to covertly combat this alien threat without causing a panic to the human population, who do and should remain blissfully unaware of the threat that's in their midst. The organisation is called S.H.A.D.O, Supreme Headquarters Alien Defence Organisation. Its main headquarters is a huge underground bunker which is located under an unassuming film studio in southern England called the Harlington Straker Film Studios. To defend the Earth, S.H.A.D.O has a battalion of weapons and bases and devices and instruments that they use to combat the aliens. Up on the moon they have Moon Base, which is manned by astronauts and space operatives. In orbit around the Earth is S.H.A.D, the Space Intruder Detector, which tracks aliens approaching Earth from deep space. On the moon base then, they launch interceptors, single missiled vehicles which launch out from underground pads to hopefully fend off the alien attacks. If the UFOs get through into the Earth's atmosphere, S.H.A.D.O has a fleet of submarines, although we mainly see Skydiver 1, which launches its detachable aircraft fighter that will hopefully find, locate and shoot down UFOs if they get through the atmosphere. If the UFOs get beyond that and make planetfall, S.H.A.D.O has a fleet of tank-like mobiles that can track down landed UFOs and destroy them. The UFOs, when they are subject to Earth's atmosphere, they will overheat and explode. And S.H.A.D.O's mission throughout the series really is to find out more about the aliens, where they come from, exactly why they're coming to Earth and what their long-term plan is. That's the format of the series, of course, you all know that. And it is sort of reflective, in a way, of Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons from 1967, which also featured a war of attrition between Mars and Earth when a human space expedition commits an atrocity to the Mysteron city and destroys it. How did UFO come about, you may ask, and I'm about to tell you. As I mentioned, and as we all know, Gerry Anderson and his wife Sylvia created this enormous back catalogue of hugely popular puppet series throughout the 1960s. But as the 60s came to an end, those sort of shows were sort of falling out of favour. The Andersons had peaked with Thunderbirds, and creatively, in terms of how they put these shows together, with Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, where they finally had puppets that actually looked like human beings, rather than human beings with enlarged heads or long lumbering limbs. The problem that ITC, who sold these shows around the world, had, and to the UK networks, is at the time the ITV networks, and this, as I mentioned before, was a time when ITV was split into separate franchise areas rather than the big homogenised ITV lump we get today. But these channels had all bought the previous Anderson shows. Their purchase deal was that they could show these programmes 3 times. So ITV's children's schedules were actually getting a bit logjammed with all these old Gerry Anderson shows. By the end of the 1960s, though, not only was Supermarionation, Gerry's particular mode of puppet television, falling out of favour slightly, but there was just no room for new content. So Gerry's last couple of shows, Joe 90, weren't picked up by many of the networks in the UK because they were already showing Thunderbirds, Captain Scarlet, even as far back as Fireball. They just didn't have any room or need for new Supermarionation content. And Gerry went into production with his most ill-advised project, The Secret Service, a quirky espionage series that only ran for 13 episodes, which was barely picked up by any networks at all. Gerry had always wanted to work in live action. It had been his ambition to do live action productions. He directed a film years ago of a short crime thriller called Crossroads to Crime, but the puppet shows have been increasingly popular. The puppet production company AP Films, which he'd set up with Arthur Provis, eventually morphed into Century 21 Productions, which in the mid to late 60s was a cottage industry of comics, books, records, TV shows, a whole plethora of entertainment based around this huge, almost Disney-esque production arm. As you probably will know, I've said on more than one occasion, I still believe that Gerry Anderson should be revered as Britain's Walt Disney, but unfortunately that's never happened and unfortunately never will. But by the end of the 60s, Gerry's desire to move into live action and away from puppets was getting extremely strong indeed. So when Lou Gray, the business magnate at ITC, who had for so long funded and encouraged Gerry in his Supermarionation work, suggested that perhaps it was time that Gerry and Sylvia moved into live action, Gerry couldn't have been happier. He'd already been making a film called Doppelganger. This was a science fiction film, which I think came out in 1969, which starred Roy Thinnis, who had recently been in a Quinn Martin science fiction series called The Invaders on American television. That had been cancelled, and as a popular TV name and face, it was felt that he would be ideal to front this new science fiction film. The film was about an astronaut who travels to the far side of the sun and finds a mirror image version of Earth, which is there. Everything on Earth is flipped round the other way around. In America, it was called Journey to the Far Side of the Sun. Originally, it was called Doppelganger in the UK, although there was some resistance to that title, apparently on the grounds that people wouldn't understand the word and would be frightened by it. And that did happen in America. They changed the title. So I will say no more about American sensibilities there. The film also starred popular British TV actor Ian Hendry, also starred Patrick Wymark, and an actor called Peter Dinley, who many will know, of course, as the voice of Jeff Tracy in Thunderbirds. During the production of the film, it was felt that Peter Dinley's acting style was a bit too similar to Patrick Wymark, so Peter Dinley was released from his contract, and a new actor was brought in to play the part. That actor was Edward Ed Bishop. He was already known to the Andersons and Anderson fans as the voice of Captain Blue in Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, an affable, likeable American actor who had long since resided in the UK. The Andersons worked well with him, they liked him, they thought he was very talented, and they brought him aboard Doppelganger. As Doppelganger was in production, Gerry Anderson was invited to do a new live-action TV science fiction show. The idea for UFO came about because Gerry had always been fascinated by stories of UFO sightings and UFO incidents and pilots who had been buzzed by something in the sky. And at the time, there was a lot of talk about investigations and reports into what exactly these things really were. So there was a thing in the air about, are aliens real? Are they coming to Earth? Are UFOs real? And that inspired in Gerry and Sylvia the idea of a series about a war between an alien planet that was coming to Earth and Earth's attempts to defend the planet. The idea built and developed, and Gerry and Sylvia worked on a pilot script for the series. Doppelganger unfortunately came and went. It wasn't a huge hit, but some elements from the film made their way into the TV series. UFO was commissioned as a 17-episode science fiction series with a pretty high budget of £4 million. That was a lot of money back then to make 17-hour-long episodes in colour of a new thrilling science fiction series, which certainly Lou Grade hoped would be sold across the world and become a new smash hit for ITC, which at the time had a great reputation for making action-adventure series on film, which were hugely popular abroad. In terms of the casting, well, that was pretty easygoing. The lead character was Commander Ed Straker, and cast to play that role, of course, was the brilliant Ed Bishop. Straker was the lead character of the series. He was the single-minded, steely, icy, emotionally detached commander of S.H.A.D.O, who lives the organisation and lives his position as the defender of the Earth. Not in a heroic superhero way, but as somebody who believes absolutely completely in what he's doing and is devoted to running S.H.A.D.O and protecting the Earth at all costs and at the cost of everything else in his own life, as we will discover in the series. In fact, Ed Straker is really the only sort of character in the series, which is one of the criticisms that the show often faced. The characters were sort of indistinguishable from the puppets of the old puppet shows. But Ed Straker was the show's real character study, a really beautifully detailed exploration of a man who's lost everything, and all he has to hang on to is his job, and his job is of incredible importance. Straker's second-hand man was Alec Freeman. He was played by George Sewell, who had appeared with Ed in Doppelganger. Sylvia Anderson cast George Sewell particularly in this part because she wanted to rail against that sort of stereotypical hero figure, the fresh-faced, young, dynamic, virile, younger man. George Sewell was 44 at the time, famously of pockmarked complexion and very granite sort of face, very untypical male hero. And I think there were some perhaps unfortunate elements to his character here. I think he does come across as a little bit leery, certainly in the first episode, where he is making comments that will be considered inappropriate today to some of the younger ladies in the cast. Sylvia and Gerry wrote the first script, and in fact Gerry directed the first episode identified, and as the series progressed and as more and more scripts were commissioned, more and more characters were introduced and more characters were cast. One of the most potentially interesting extra characters was going to be the young male lead who would be the commander of Moonbase, S.H.A.D.O's Lunar Defense Network. This character, Colonel De Sica, was played by Italian actor Franco De Rosso, who had appeared previously again in Doppelganger. Also cast was the vivacious Gabriel Drake as a Moonbase operative, Paula Harris. Another Moonbase operative, Joan Harrington, was played by Antonia Ellis. And Nina Barry, a third glamorous Moonbase operative, was played by Dolores Mantes. Other cast members came on board. Australian actor Keith Alexander played Lieutenant Keith Ford, one of the operatives at S.H.A.D.O's subterranean headquarters underneath the film studios. Dancer and singer Aisha Broth, she played Lieutenant Johnson, another S.H.A.D.O operative who would in fact appear throughout the entire run of the series, as it turned out. The show started production in April 1969 with some model work by Derek Meddings. He created for UFO, I think, some of the most memorable and dynamic vehicles in any science fiction show, Anderson or otherwise, from the iconic Moonbase interceptors with their one missile, those tank-like mobiles, fantastic Skydiver, which is part Stingray, part Thunderbird 4, and any number of other aircraft and devices that were used throughout the series. Fantastically iconic, and of course, we remember UFO, as we do a lot of Anderson shows, for those fantastic launch sequences of the ships. Skydiver tilting in the water, Sky One bursting free from the main body, the interceptors launching up from their pads, flying into space. These were scenes that, of course, that were repeated throughout episode after episode. And we knew that, I'm sure we knew that, as we knew with Thunderbirds, that every liftoff of the Thunderbird craft was exactly the same. But there's something so exciting and exhilarating with the music, of course. Barry Gray's pounding music made it all look fresh and new every week, even though we were seeing the same scenes all the time. But these designs for these machines were iconic, and they've outlived the series in ways that Gerry Anderson could certainly not expected. Live action also began in April 1969 with the first episode Identified, and Identified is a really clever script because it, slightly clunkily in places I think, delivers everything you need to know about the series. Let's talk about that fantastic title sequence, which is made up of clips taken from the first couple of episodes which had been produced by then. It starts off with that extremely memorable and queasy sequence of an alien's face with its eye covering thing being removed, and then the title UFO flashes up. We're told it's 1980. We see a typeface rattling across the screen, introducing all the various elements from Moonbase, the Interceptor, Skydiver, the mobiles, showing us all the hardware in this incredible title sequence, all intercut with scenes of action from those first few episodes. It's incredibly dynamic, and of course, Barry Gray's theme music is still one of the best TV theme musics of all time, and it's in fact the ringtone of my phone and has been for some time. It's just a fantastic adrenalized title sequence, and when you watch an episode, it sort of gets you in the mood for what's to come in the next 50 minutes. The first episode then really sets things up well. It starts off with a character called Peter Carlin, played by Peter Gordino. I'll tell you more about him in a bit. He and his sister and his sister's friend are in the woods somewhere, and they see a UFO nestled nearby. Suddenly they are attacked by an alien. There's gunfire, their friend is killed, Peter Carlin is shot and injured, and the last sight we see is his sister Leela cowering in fear and screaming as something alien approaches her. We then cut to Colonel Ed Straker. This is 1970, and this is where we see the beginning of S.H.A.D.O. Straker has his top secret attaché case. Inside the attaché case are some documents which will prove the existence of aliens and the threat that's come to Earth. However, the aliens are aware of what's going on, and they shoot Straker's car, crashes off the road, and the title sequence comes across the screen, UFO. Then we move forward to 1980 itself, and we see Straker arriving at Harlington Straker Studios. We see him descend the lift that takes him to S.H.A.D.O HQ underneath, and this is where we open up the entire story of what's going on. There's a sequence where there's been a potential security leak, and Straker calls Lieutenant Ford, played by Keith Alexander, into his office and tears him off a strip. And this gives Straker a chance to sort of outline the entire scenario of the series, which is quite clever, but it seems a bit clunky in retrospect. He explains about Skydiver and Moonbase and S.H.A.D.O. He explains the scenario of the whole series. The plot itself for that episode revolves around the aliens who are trying to destroy some new tracking equipment, which S.H.A.D.O is about to take control of. There's a very exciting action sequence. We see all the S.H.A.D.O machines in action apart from the mobiles. Sky One launches to shoot down this UFO, which crashes in the water. An alien body is recovered. That's one of the things that S.H.A.D.O are after, the aliens, to get hold of the bodies to find out what makes them tick. And that's when we tie into the beginning of the episode, when the autopsy reveals that some of the body parts are actually Peter Carlin's sister Leela, who we saw at the first episode. Peter is now the commander of the skydiver machine. So it's a very neat, very clever first episode. It's very fast, very well paced, and it really sets up what this series is all about. As the series went on into production, there were some production issues in terms of cast and so on. Franco De Rosa was proving less than competent in his role as Colonel De, and at the end of the first week he was released from his contract and let go. Gabrielle Drake, who played Paula Harris, one of the S.H.A.D.O Moonbase operatives, she was promoted to the commander of Moonbase. This was quite forward thinking at the time. Gerry Anderson was quite keen to have women in positions of power, not just being sort of background glamour. And Paula Harris's character was promoted to the commander of Moonbase, and her name was changed to Gay Ellis. Gabrielle Drake, she was often called by her friends as Gay, so she became Gay Ellis, the commander of Moonbase. A new character was introduced, a new male lead came in, actor Michael Billington. He was recommended by Peter Godino, who played Peter Carlin. He'd worked with him previously, and he was a very chiselled, very masculine character, which is just what the show needed as a third lead wheel. And he was cast as Colonel Paul Foster, and he was introduced in a newly written second episode. Episode structures had to be changed a little bit when the character of De was written out, because things that he was supposed to be doing ultimately ended up being done by Paul Foster. Peter Godino himself, the dancer who'd been recruited to play Peter Carlin, he was let go after 6 episodes because there were some issues with his acting. He wasn't an actor, he was a dancer and a stage performer. And whilst his performance is perfectly serviceable, I think that Gerry Anderson felt there was some problems with him, perhaps being able to deal with some of the heavier material that might be required later on in the series. And they fashioned a way to write him out of the series after just 6 episodes. By now, it was summer, 69. The show was up on its feet and it was working, and the episodes started rolling out of the production line till the 17-episode order was completed. Those 17 episodes, watched now in splendid isolation, I think they're fantastic episodes. There are some great episodes in there, some really exciting episodes. There are some slightly duller episodes, but I think what they all suffer from is a problem with the pacing, because Gerry had, out of loyalty, brought in some of the directors he'd worked with in the puppet shows, and some of them, particularly people like David Lane, had no experience with actors, and they found the transition from puppets into live action quite difficult. I know that David Lane in particular had said that he was driving to work and he would stop the car to be sick in the road and hope that he'd get knocked over on the way to the studio, because he was so terrified of the pressure of creating this quite big budget live action adventure sci-fi show. So there are pacing issues in those first stories, and the main issue I think that has to be accepted is that there's not a lot of character to anybody apart from Straker. The characters are very much one note. You get Alec Freeman, who's this sort of older Jack the Lad type, who is clearly Straker's right-hand man and best friend, but he has little to do in most of the episodes. He sort of swans in and out now and again. Paul Foster is the action hero, but his performances are a little stilted. The whole thing does suffer a little bit from that transition, unfortunately, from the puppets to the live action. They're finding their feet and finding the way to do things with actors. And I know Gerry Anderson himself said that much as he complained about the puppets, when he had live actors, he had to confront egos, people with drink problems, people with drug problems, people not turning up on time, all those human foibles that have to be dealt with when you're working with a large ensemble cast and lots of guest actors. The show boasted a number of very well regarded actors in supporting roles, people like Adrian Corey, Patrick Mower, Darren Nesbitt, Alexis Canna. Some quite well regarded TV names took guest roles in this series once they realised that it wasn't just a kids puppet show and there was a bit more to it than that. But I think the 17 episodes from MGM in Boreham Wood, they do feel a bit stilted. I mean, I love them, I think they're great, there's some really good stories there, but there are some slightly plodding episodes, and you do sort of wish that other characters had been a bit more fleshed out. But Straker, I think, makes up for it, because he is such a human study in a man who cares about nothing except his job and will throw everything away to protect his planet. It's an incredible performance by Ed Bishop, who, given this sort of silver wig that he had to wear and these sort of buttoned up Nehru jackets that was part of the Century 21 fashions that Gerry Anderson encouraged for the show, he comes across as almost as inhuman as the aliens in a way. We talk about the fashions as well, the various different costumes. There was a very considered effort to make 1980 look more futuristic than it could ever be. Gerry Anderson saw a clean, bright future, and that is very much depicted in the lines of the costumes that people wore, the cars with their gull-wing doors, which never actually worked. They had to be held open by stagehands. And it was all very clean and sophisticated, and the idea that racism had burnt itself out in the 70s, bearing in mind it was only sort of 11 years in the future, perhaps a little naive to think that the world would change that much. But certainly in terms of the costumes, you had the very striking Moonbase operatives in their figure-hugging silver costumes with those purple wigs. There's no explanation for the purple wigs in the series, but they just look good. Aboard Skydiver, you have all the operatives wearing these string vest type things, and the commander wearing like a leather jacket, and the figure-hugging uniforms that the S.H.A.D.O operatives wore at HQ. It's a very well thought out look to all these characters in this series. As the show was approaching the end of its 17 episode initial order, Lew Grade was starting to think about getting those American networks on board, and as with previous Anderson shows, he didn't have much success. The American networks weren't interested, and for a big budget show like UFO, that was a problem. He did, however, manage to get it sold into syndication in America. That's all the little satellite outlier stations that encircle the networks themselves. A lot of them took on the show, but syndication needs a lot of episodes. 17 wasn't enough, so a further 9 episodes were commissioned. By the time UFO finished its 17th episode, the MGM studios at Boreham Wood, which were a little bit antiquated, they closed down and were sold off. So the whole UFO production, months later, moved across to Pinewood Studios with its more sophisticated and modern facilities. New directors came on board, directors with a slightly pacier style, and scripts were touched up slightly, and the scripts began to explore not just the simple idea of the aliens coming to Earth in their hugely memorable whirling dervish flying saucers, but explore other ways that the aliens might use more psychological weapons in their battle against mankind. Mind control, bodily possession, the idea expressed at some point that perhaps the aliens have evolved out of having bodies at all and just exist as a sort of life force. Quite interesting concepts that were threaded throughout those last 9 episodes, which do have a much pacier feel to them, much more energized. There's less character stuff for Ed Straker, it has to be said. I think that he throws himself into action a lot more. They have a fantastic pace and dynamism that isn't there in a lot of those first episodes, and I think it shows a lot of potential for what could have happened if the show had been allowed to proceed. You felt that the show was now coming together with the right people making it, and the right scripts, imaginative scripts that were taking the show in slightly different directions, still with Ed Bishop leading the company. The company itself, incidentally, changed across those months in between the first and second batches of episodes. There had been complaints from New York about George Sewell. It was felt that he wasn't an attractive enough screen proposition, so he was written out completely in the next batch of episodes. The character was written out. George Sewell was working elsewhere anyway, but he expected to come back. I think Gerry Anderson, slightly embarrassed, had to come up with some excuse for him not to come back into the series. His character was replaced by Wanda Ventham's Colonel Virginia Lake, who had appeared in Identified, the first episode, as a S.H.A.D.O operative. She now came back as a colonel to replace Alec Freeman. There was no explanation of where these people had gone. It was just that they were no longer there. Gabrielle Drake also, she was unavailable to come back as Gay Ellis on Moonbase. So Nina Barry was often seen to be in command of Moonbase, and occasionally Paul Foster, Michael Billington's character, would be up on the moon, running operations from the lunar base. Filming for the series eventually finished in September 1970. This was a good 18 months after it had started in Boreham Wood in 1969. The show now was coming together, it was being completed, the earlier episodes were ready to go, started screening in Canada on the 14th of September 1970, and a couple of days later in the UK. UFO, however, suffered from the same problems that had bedeviled the later Anderson shows, in that the UK networks didn't want another Anderson show because they just assumed it was more of the same that they'd had. Plus, I think seeing some of the episodes, and I think it's a valid criticism, it's sort of hard to work out exactly who it's aimed at. It's adult in its themes, in some of its situations depicted in some stories, and yet it's full of Anderson special effects and machines that sort of tear it in a different direction. Because you have stories about marital strife and breakdown. You have stories about people having affairs and trying to kill off their husbands. You have stories specifically the long slate, which just touches on drugs. And Mindbender, another late episode, is about the effect of psychotropic drugs on shadow personnel. So there's a lot of sort of adult themes there, wearing the clothes of an earlier Anderson children's production. And certainly the British TV networks couldn't make head nor tail of it, couldn't decide what to do with it. As a result, the networks that did take it, and some of them didn't take it for years, placed it in morning slots, and then a couple of episodes would turn up in late night slots. It very rarely had a prime time slot where it would establish an audience. And of course, with it being scattered across various networks in different slots, it never had the momentum to become the hit it should have been. In fact, my area, HTV in the Wales and West, we didn't get it till 1972 when it was shown early Saturday afternoons. And I distinctly remember very often having to battle between watching Doctor Who on BBC One or UFO on ITV. But I love the series for all its faults and all its problems in terms of its production and the issues about scripts and characters and actors. I just love the concept of it, and I love the hardware of it, and I love those characters. I still think Ed Straker is one of the great underrated science fiction heroes, with so much to him that could have been explored if the show had carried on. In the handful of episodes we get which look at his character and his life, absolutely captivating stuff that as a youngster watching it really irritated me, because I obviously, as a 12, 13-year-old, I wanted the spaceships, I wanted the space battles, despite the fact that there are in fact a couple of episodes. There's a very well mounted sequence where the aliens attack the moon, and there's spaceships flying around and the ground defences are attacking and moon bases under attack. Those scenes appear in one episode which is called Reflections in the Water, and then they appear again in an episode a couple of episodes later. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter that these scenes had been filmed and were reused. That's what Anderson did. That was their technique, is to make stock shots. Occasionally they weren't quite as stock as they should have been. But I just think it's a terrific show with a great cast of interesting people, even though they're not all well defined as characters. And it looks so bright and colourful. It looks so ahead of its time, the costumes and the designs of things, the way it was filmed. It has a real forward-thinking ethos to it, which you didn't get so much at that time. And I think probably one of the mistakes was setting it in 1980. But then if you set it later than that, they would have had to make things a bit more futuristic. So I can see why they did, but of course it became dated very quickly. UFO, although it wasn't a hit at the time, it is one of those shows whose reputation has grown enormously as people have discovered it over the years. Each new generation of viewers loves it and finds things to enjoy in it and gets fascinated by Ed Straker's character and the hardware. It is a show whose reputation has grown and grown and grown as the years have gone by. So as I said, the show wasn't a hit and it sort of faded away. Apparently, until 1972, when it started being screened in syndication in New York, where it was topping the ratings every week for week after week after week. Abe Mandel, who was in charge of ITC in America, contacted Lou Grade in the UK and said, "This UFO, bit of a hit. Let's have a second series." This was 2 years after the show had finished production. Plans were put in place for a second series of UFO. Now, the edict was to be that the Earth-based stories were very popular. It was all to be set on the moon. So Gerry Anderson, whose relationship with his wife Sylvia was at the point of collapse at this point. There were lots of issues during the filming of the show where Gerry and Sylvia were butting heads enormously. And of course they did eventually have an acrimonious divorce in the mid-70s. But they were still together at this point, and they started putting together plans for UFO 2, which would be set on the moon, would have Straker on the moon, and would have much more focus on that lunar community. However, as those plans were being drawn up, the ratings tailed off in America, and ITC got cold feet and the project was cancelled. But as we know, Gerry Anderson, I think I referred to this in my Space 1999 video, never one to waste an idea, retooled the concept, and it became Space 1999, and that of course is a video further back that way. So that is UFO. I think a bit scattergun in terms of how I've talked about it, because even though it's just one series of 26 episodes, there's a lot of moving parts, from the casting, the scripting, the production problems, cast coming and going, that gap in between the first block and the second block. And I just think the production of it is as fascinating as the series itself. But it still remains a firm favourite of mine. I could watch any episode, even some of the ones I don't like very much, at any time and just find them absolutely enthralling. In terms of after image, I mean, this could be a whole hour-long video in itself, because UFOs after him, which continues to this day. But I think if we look at the contemporary stuff that came out when the show was released, one of the first pieces of merchandise, and one that I think most fans will have, is the UFO Annual, which came out for, I think, Christmas 1971. I remember picking this up in a supermarket in Cardiff when I went to Santa's Grotto, and I remember very clearly seeing this massive pile of these UFO annuals, hundreds of them, I think. And although I'd not seen the series at that point, it was the sort of thing I knew I'd be interested in, and I picked up this annual, and it is, whilst not the Bible of UFO merchandise, it is the one that everybody sort of has in their collection, because it is the bedrock of their collection, with this great image of a spinning UFO, Straker in the corner, and it's full of photographs, text features, text stories, and I think for the fans, it's the photographs that were the main thing, because you've got all these great photographs of the tech and the machines and all the gadgets and so on. It's a really good book, and I had this for years, stupidly disposed of it years ago, and purely by chance came across a copy in a charity shop in Cardiff 3 or 4 years ago, and obviously grabbed it instantly. It's in really good condition, and I ain't letting this one go anytime soon. I suppose the Bible of UFO books is one which didn't come out at the time. It came out years later, and it's called The Complete Book of Gerry Anderson's UFO. This is the revised and expanded edition. Now, this came out, was out of print for years, then it was re-released and updated in 2016. And again, beautifully illustrated. I mean, this is everything you want to know. Every episode looked at in depth, all the behind the scenes stuff about the making, beautiful photographs printed extraordinarily, stuff about merchandise like jigsaws and books, which I'll come to shortly. This went out of print again very quickly. You can't get hold of it now. This came out 30 quid, I'll say, came out in 2016, and again is a book that is essential for UFO fans, because as I said, it's not so easy to get hold of now. Looking back to stuff which came out at the time, again, iconic books, the two paperback adaptations, UFO and UFO 2, both written by Robert Mile, who was in fact a pen name for a writer called John Burke, who wrote lots of books based on ITC properties at the time. These are great books. I read these a couple of years ago, and they're fascinating books. They're both, easy read, 110, 120 pages, but they're actually written from early versions of the scripts. So you get material in here which didn't appear in TV episodes. You get more in-depth characterizations. Things are slightly different in terms of the characters and the way they behave. And they are sort of novelizations of parts of certain episodes. But they're very well written, actually. These are sort of UFO as adult fiction, really. What's interesting about the first book is that the last part novelizes a couple of episodes which hadn't actually been screened yet. I think Court Martial, which hadn't been shown when the book came out, is featured in this particular book. You can get hold of these fairly easily on eBay. I had these. These aren't my original copies. I relocated these a couple of years ago. But they're excellent books in their own right. Other merchandise, of course, Gerry Anderson Hardware was bound to attract merchandisers like Dinky, who made models of Ed Straker's Gullwing car. They made model of the Mobile, and they made a model of the UFO Interceptor. And I have here the model which I procured back in the 1970s of the UFO Interceptor. This missile is a replica of the original because that went astray a long time ago. You will notice that the Interceptor is painted green, whereas the Interceptors on screen were a vivid white. This apparently is because Dinky, the manufacturers, they had a job lot of green paint left over in their factories. I suspect that was left over from their Thunderbird 2 replicas a few years ago, and they thought, well, we'll just paint these green. So obviously not completely screen accurate. I mean, they're beautiful models, they're fantastically detailed. This is in fact the original one I had back in the day, so it's a bit paint chipped. But I think it's interesting that quality control just allowed them to go out as this colour instead of white. And I think there was also some thinking that boys wouldn't buy white coloured, bland looking toys. It's a different world. But UFO merchandise continues to this day. The show was a huge hit in Japan, and a company I think they called Kaomi, they made umpteen miniatures of UFO figures over the years, from Interceptors, Mobiles and so on. And you can still get some of those, and you will see some footage playing now of my own little collection of UFO models. Anderson Entertainment is still releasing them. There's a UFO model which came out fairly recently. These are various ones I picked up at different places at different times over the years. Anderson Entertainment, of course, are keeping the flame alive of all Gerry Anderson shows, and a new UFO novel, or novella, came out last year, written by James Swallow, called S.H.A.D.O Play. This is a story, again, probably a sort of second half of the season in style about Ed Straker's sort of psychosis as he thinks he sees aliens wherever he goes. And of course we have, you'll see over there, the UFO comic anthologies, I won't drag them down, which collect all the comic strips which appeared in Countdown comic from 1971 till about 1973. Really interesting comics. Some of them are quite extreme, but some of them take the concepts of the series in some quite interesting directions that the show might well have done had it continued. So that's just a very broad range of some of the UFO material. I must of course mention, it's available on Blu-ray. Network released it a few years ago. I don't know if you can still get this, of course, because Network is no longer in existence. And when this came out, this very, very nice box set, it also came with this incredibly chunky book written by the great Andrew Pixley. And in fact, a lot of the information I've told you about the show today comes from this fantastic 600-page book, which looks at the history of the show, looks at the episodes. I mean, it's an astonishing book. Absolutely astonishing in terms of the depth it goes into. That, I think, is not available now because that came out with the UFO series. And there's also this available. Back in the 80s, a company called Channel 5 put together compilations of Gerry Anderson shows to release on VHS. And they released one called Invasion UFO, which was a cut and paste sort of hacking job of several UFO episodes slung together with an unbelievably cheesy new title sequence and theme music. This, I think, you could probably still pick up. It's a curio, shall we say. And again, for completists, there is a new Blu-ray edition which has just been released by Imprint Publishing in Australia, and that is on my wish list, and I'll be picking that one up in the next few months, hopefully. And that's a fairly quick rattle through UFO. As I said, I do apologise, it's been a bit scattergun. I wanted to give a sort of a feel for how the show came about and the end of the Supermarionation era, moving into that tricky live action phase. And UFO, for all its faults, the critics at the time said the acting was as wooden as the puppets. There are faults with the pacing, and there are faults with lack of characterization, because I think Gerry Anderson was more interested in incident, whereas Sylvia liked to develop characters, and that presumably was part of their conflict at the time. But I think it is still a hugely accomplished show, and as I've said, it's right up there for me as one of my favourite shows of all time. This is part one of my look at UFO. I am going to do part two in the next few days, which is going to be my top 6. I don't know why 6, I've just decided on 6. My top 6 UFO episodes. I was planning to do that as part of this video, but then realised that would take a very long time. This video itself is about 50 minutes, and I do apologise for that, but there's a lot to get through. So coming up in the next day or so will be part 2 of my look at UFO, which will be my top 6 episodes. And if you're familiar with the series, and if you bear in mind the fact that I watched it when I was 12, my top shows might be a bit of a surprise. So if you're interested, please stick around, because that's coming very soon. Right, thank you for watching this video. If you've stuck with it all the way through, I know it's been a long old haul, but I hope it's been interesting, and I hope it's brought back some fond memories of a great science fiction show from the glory days of British telefantasy. Thank you for watching. As I said, if you are new here, think about liking and subscribing, because there's loads of this sort of stuff. It doesn't always go on for 50 minutes, but there's loads of classic genre shows here. Just look back on the back catalogue of stuff you've probably forgotten all about, and take a look, and there's loads of stuff to come, so please stick around. It'd be lovely to have you on board. Right, I will see you soon. Until I do, yeah, keep taking the stuff.